feels like summer. It is not quite summer, so it's called the spring meeting. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. You should have just got notification that we are recording the meeting. As we all agreed last time, we after some time, the videos are processed and posted on the member hub. So you can still find the meeting videos from last our winter February meeting on the hub as well. But it's for those who don't know, I'm Megan Hopkins. I'm one of the co-advisors for the EL Collaborative. For the next hour or so, you'll get to hear from Kenji, the other co-advisor for the EL Collaborative. As always, he has words of wisdom to share with us. And then I'm going to give us kind of an overview of the next 3 days to frame our work together. And then we have an exciting opportunity to hear from Alana Umansky around a new resource. Before we give you all time in breakout rooms just to do informal check-ins, we'll pretend we're sitting around round tables in a ballroom and have the opportunity. Folks have asked for some space to really talk to folks, see how things are going. And so after we do our welcome presentations this morning, we will have a half hour, hopefully about 20 minutes to a half hour for folks to informally check in. And then we'll start right at, let me do the time change, 10 a.m. and 1 o'clock with our US Ed updates. So without further ado, I want to, and I would also just say before we start, it's really helpful for presenters and even for me and Kenji to see folks' faces. So if you are not eating, if you're comfortable, if you're willing to, we would love to have cameras on, but we know that folks are busy and have other things going on. I happen to be in the office today, but I usually have a child crawling around behind me. So I 100% get it if the video is not possible, but we do love to see your faces. It helps us feel more connected. So thank you for those who just popped up. Kenji, I want to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Megan. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Great to see you. And if you could just pop the first slide. Yesterday was the 100th birthday centennial of Edmund W. Gordon. And you may not be everybody's on everybody's everyday vocabulary of names. But Edmund Gordon is probably one of the most prominent Black psychologists of this era. And if you could turn to the next slide, there's Ed and me, and his wonderful portrait of he and his late wife, Susan, in his background. Ed was my mentor at my first academic job, which was in the psychology department at Yale University back in 1979. At that time, he seemed like a towering, very senior figure. It turns out he was only 58 or so. But at that time, when I was 20 something, he certainly seemed like a very old and wise character, but we've continued our relationship over time. And a few years ago, as I was starting to enter the more reflective part of my career, I went back and visited him, and we started some conversations. And ultimately, as it turns out, he asked me to help steer a series of events that celebrate his 100th birthday. If you turn to the next slide. As I said, he was probably the most prominent Black psychologist of his era. He held endowed faculty positions at Yale University and also at Teachers College in Columbia. He's a member of just about every elite distinguished club of academics and Black activists of this era. Next slide, please. One of his important mentors, as it turned out, we talked quite a bit especially over the course of the last few years, but throughout, not a conversation with him would go by without him mentioning W.E.B. Du Bois, who in their lives overlapped in the 50s. Du Bois was born in 1968, was the first PhD from Harvard University in history and philosophy, studied with William James, was also the founder of the NAACP, and unrecognized, he really was the founder of the field of sociology, a book that recently came out by Alden Morris, a sociologist, recognized the unrecognized contributions that he made to the founding of the field. Next slide, please. One of his inspirations was Frederick Douglass, who was born in 1817, famous abolitionist who escaped slavery, incredibly eloquent orator. He wrote several significant autobiographies, and he engaged in dialogue across the color line. It was really quite remarkable, the contributions that he made to for abolitionist movement, leading that, and quite effectively. Next slide, please. When Douglass died in 1895, Du Bois was 27 years old. He had just taken an academic, a teaching position at the historically Black college, Wilberforce in Ohio. And in noting the passing of Douglass, he noted him as an advocate of civil rights who stood outside mere race lines and placed himself upon the broad basis of humanity. So Douglass as statesman. Next slide, please. In the eulogy, he also used this as an inspiration for the next generation. He told the students, "When duty whispers, lo, thou must, the youth replies, I can." And he really kind of used the story of his life in Douglass to encourage and to create a chain of activism. And I think that's an important lesson for us to remember and reflect on. Then next slide, please. Along comes Edmund Gordon, and a lot of our conversations have focused on his life in the 50s and early 60s when they overlapped significantly in New York when Du Bois was in his 80s and early 90s, just before he famously renounced his American citizenship and moved to Ghana, where he passed. Edmund Gordon was born in 1921 in East Goldsboro, North Carolina, to a very successful physician who attended to the needs of the Black community and was a community leader. Like many privileged Blacks who still lived in segregation, Ed went to college at Howard University, where he reportedly almost dropped out because of his poor academics, but was mentored by important figures like Alan Locke and Howard Thurman, the theologian, and grew up in the spirit of theology and divinity, which many Black leaders in those eras sought their path to leadership. And during that era, he also met his wife, Susan, whose portrait you saw earlier, who came back from a Pennsylvania progressive tradition. And he got a degree in psychology, and the young Gordons moved to New York, where he met Du Bois and carried his bags. And one of the conversations we have is, what did he really get from Du Bois that kind of continued this chain? And he said, have you heard of the word deontic? deontic philosophy. And I sort of had remembered hearing something about it as one of those words, but it really has to do with sort of moral principles. And the way that Du Bois referred to it was how if you generate knowledge, it's not enough to just generate the knowledge. You have to do something with it, and it carries a moral obligation to benefit others around you who need help. And that's how he interpreted Du Bois's passion about scholarship and sociology and the field, even though Du Bois himself was denied the kind of scholarly stature around that. He really believed in the importance of scholarship to do good. And that's actually what I got from Ed Gordon was the importance of doing scholarship that benefits society. Next slide. Gordon also worked with this couple. He was a research assistant to the research that the Clarks did in the famous Dahl study that led to was the important social science basis for the Brown v. Board decision in 1954. And so, as a young student, he had that connection with the work of the Clarks. And next slide. Of course, the Brown decision, which is noted on the top left, led to the Civil Rights Act, signed by Johnson in the middle. And really, where we live now around assessment and accountability in the ESEA is really kind of a direct lineage, has a direct lineage from that line of work. Next slide. So, but Ed, as it turned out, as we talked, really is very uncomfortable, as many of us are, but he's very uncomfortable with the excessive focus on assessment for accountability. And as we talked, I kind of got to see the roots of this in his own thinking. One of them is that he was, during the Johnson administration, the first research director for Head Start. So he was very involved with Head Start. And of course, Head Start has a much broader perspective on who's responsible for learning and the ways in which we see outcomes of learning, even though they've been sort of battered also by the accountability movement. Still, that experience of sort of seeing the importance of a much broader view of learning and so forth, as well as the people that are responsible for the learning, including the parents and community, as being an important piece of his thinking. And the other was his early experience, and I didn't know this until we talked about it explicitly. He got his start really not in academic psychology, but in clinical psychology, working in the Jewish hospital in Brooklyn, where he did assessment. And it was psychological assessment, much in the tradition of Binet, whose picture is up on the top right. And Alfred Binet was the French educator who developed the IQ test, but the IQ test really was not intended to rank and sort kids. Binet's vision was to use it for knowing how to address the issues that the child was facing, a formative assessment practice, which he then, Gordon, there's a commission on assessment called the Gordon Commission that the Educational Testing Service funded, which comes up with those recommendations. So I not kind of realized his passion for formative assessment. Finally, I would say that the importance of thinking about or the problem that he points to is is really thinking about, that comes out of Brown, is really thinking of sameness as equality. And that really is the desegregation efforts. And yet, really, what we really need is for there to be appropriate ways of creating opportunities for equal educational opportunity. Now, the Civil Rights Act, which also gives basis to Lau v. Nichols, talks about affirmative efforts to rectify. It's still in the deficit language, but it is an effort to sort of say it may be the same, merely giving students the same textbooks if kids don't understand language is not important, and therefore they really need to address the language issues for the students in various ways that are appropriate to students. And that is really what leads to the Castañeda framework that we have. That is, we need some appropriate theory that continues to be worked on. Final moment of inspiration. Next slide. Where do we draw some of these inspirations? And it turns out Ed and his wife Susan were very close friends to the artist Charles White, one of the most noted visual artists whose works really depicted a lot of the Black and civil rights struggle, and they were close friends. Ed considered him to be the closest thing to a brother that he has had. And I think it's really important to point to sources of inspiration in not just our lineage intellectually, but also to sources of inspiration that come from the arts. The other piece that's important in thinking about lineage and the future and the chain of knowledge and advocacy is the following slide. And I won't promise I won't read this, because I could never justify reading something as powerful as what Amanda Gorman read at the inauguration for President Biden and Vice President Harris. But turning to youth for inspiration, I think, is really the way in which we can inspire ourselves. And Megan, if you could just click over 2 more slides, the last one. Next one, I think. Anyway, I'm going to end there. I'm again not going to read this. Let you read it for yourselves. But it really is, kind of our moment and the next generation's moment to take these, what has preceded them, to think broadly and to move forward. So I will pass this on now, Megan, to you.
Thank you, Kenji. I know you've been doing a lot of work with Edward Gordon over your lifetime, but in the last year in terms of documenting his life's work. So thank you for sharing that with us. It is definitely relevant in terms of how we're constructing our work together in upholding civil rights for students identified as English learners across the United States, and the deep and important work that you all have in doing that work and implementing change, and the important work that we have in supporting you all in doing so. So as Kenji mentioned, a lot of this kind of leads up to, how is this shaping our work, your work as state leaders and my work as an educational researcher, in terms of thinking about how do we ensure access to an equitable education for English learners. And so this is a framework we're all well aware of, just as to situate us together, thinking about the Castañeda framework and its alignment with continuous improvement processes and the role that each of us has to play in moving this work forward. So those of us who work in programs, as well as those of us who work in data and assessment, those who work in outside organizations and institutes of higher education and CCSSO, this work that we can do to support the selection of programs that are based on sound theory, to ensure that those programs are implemented well with sufficient resources and personnel, so funding and staffing, and then engaging in ongoing evaluation efforts to see if those programs are ensuring student progress, perhaps talking to students, parents, community members to see if those efforts have been successful, and then returning to the selection of programs or the redesign of programs based on those learnings. And so there's really a hope that everyone sees that there's a role for each of us to play in sort of moving this framework forward toward equity and civil rights for English learners. And that's really going to ground our work together over the next 3 days. I also want to return to the framework that Maddie Mavrocordato and Rebecca Callahan presented at our last meeting that really thinks about how leaders can support the implementation of the Castañeda framework, not just leaders, but also researchers, again, all of the stakeholders at play in this field. And the figure here is a framework of thinking about policy implementation for social justice. And so if we think of ourselves as folks who are implementing civil rights policy from the federal level, but also thinking about state policy implementation, Maddie and her colleague Rachel White look at this along 2 axes. So the first being from a perfunctory understanding to a deep understanding of the law and its provisions. And then the other axis being from a technical approach to a transformative approach, in terms of a technical approach that focuses on compliance, which is important and is an important baseline and guardrail for us. But thinking more about shifting from compliance or augmenting compliance toward transformation and transformative approaches and actions for students identified as English learners. And so what we're going to focus on the next 3 days is really thinking about how do we shift our frameworks. And this is a question for myself too. I don't pretend to have the answers to this, and neither does Kenji. How do we shift from, how do we move from that technical approach to that transformative approach, and how do we support one another in doing so? So I wanted to hone in on some of the things that Maddie and Rebecca talked to us last time about the things that sort of exemplify a technical approach and exemplify a transformative approach based on their research with state and local leaders. So if you look down at the bottom, the technical approach, and the technical approach should not be viewed as bad, right? Like compliance is necessary, adherence to the law is necessary, understanding the law is necessary. But it also might connote that responsibility rests with particular individuals rather than is shared across an organization or a school or a district. And it might be limited by external constraints, funding, resources, or even self-imposed constraints. Well, that's not my role, or I can't get folks to partner with me. Like this isn't my responsibility. To thinking toward a transformative approach. And in their work together, they identified some actions that leaders took that aligned with each of the prongs of Castañeda. So thinking about how to base decisions on sound theory and research around prong 1, really emphasizing in the deepening of research understanding across an organization, whether that's a state education agency or a local education agency or a school. Focusing on that articulation of sound theory and evidence-based programming, kind of making sure we all have common understandings of that and developing a critical lens in that work, because we also know the evidence base is constantly evolving as we learn more about serving students equitably. And then thinking about implementing programs with sufficient resources and personnel along with prong 2, thinking about whether funds are being spent to support a coordinated plan. So we're going to have the opportunity to think about funding today and whether it's being leveraged, and whether and how it's being leveraged in ways that foster equity during recovery efforts from COVID and beyond. Also thinking about stretching capacity over an entire organization so it doesn't rest with one person, so that responsibility is shared. And thinking about a system-wide coherence around a vision. So what is the vision for EL equity? And how do we all uphold that through the programming and the personnel, the implementation that we support. And then thinking about ongoing evaluation of those programs around prong 3. So again, folks from programs who focus on programs and district supports, really partnering with folks in data and assessment and accountability to think about what are the measures that we can look at to inform monitoring efforts. Thinking about formative assessment tools, going back to Edward Gordon's presentation, ideas around formative assessment and the importance of not just standardized tests, standardized statewide assessments, and what formative assessment tools can really inform our review of practice, and then leading and engaging those continuous improvement cycles that take us through the Castañeda framework, not just 1, 2, 3, but sort of back up to 1 once we've really thought about the evidence of our programs, from our programs. So as we think about doing this work together, here are just a few guiding questions for the next 3 days. So how can I, each of us, take on or support transformative approaches to policy implementation in my state? So how might I partner with somebody else to facilitate this? Or what is something that I can personally do? With whom can I partner? What information do I need to gather particularly from folks in data and assessment, from folks at the local level? How can I engage researchers to help me gather that information, to really know what's going on in my state, to make mindful and purposeful decisions? And then what resources might be useful in supporting this work, in taking a resource to someone, another state leader, and saying, look, this is, this comes from CCSSO, or this comes from the Migration Policy Institute, and these are the things that we could be doing. So thinking about what resources might be useful, we have over time talked through a set of resources that are based on COVID, based on supports for English learners during and after COVID-19. We have over time presented on each of these resources, and we've also looked at sort of the overall framework that aligns with Castañeda. These resources are coming soon. There is a framing guide that talks about the Castañeda framework and how each of these resources can be used in supporting that work. Part 1, again, focuses on sound theory and research and their resources around instruction, program models, and attendance and re-engaging English learners. Part 2 focuses on that funding and staffing around shared responsibility. And then Part 3 provides a progress monitoring tool for folks to use to support prong 3. So just wanted you to know that those draft resources are in the member hub, but they're also going to be published to the public soon. So those are coming soon, but they're all already available to collaborative members. And then the next resource, we wanted to take a moment to announce a brand new resource coming out of Institutes for Education Sciences and one of the new centers focused on secondary English learners. So I'm going to turn it over to Alana Umansky to share very briefly about this new resource before we give you all time to check in with one another. So Alana.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. And Kenji, that was such a wonderful and inspiring opening talk, and made me feel like I should declare my place in the lineage, which is, that Kenji was my advisor. And I feel like one of the things that you really also taught me, and it sounds like came passed down through Dr. Gordon and the enormously important people before him that you mentioned, is that commitment to research for social good and for enacting change. So I just want you to know that you have a huge role in that line as well, Kenji. So yeah, it's great to be here, and I wanted to talk about, well, mostly I wanted this just to be a teaser, because we're hoping that in July, we're gonna have a webinar for all of you to really go over some of the findings of the 2 studies that I'm gonna mention right now. So basically, I'm just trying to whet your appetite about this, but basically, I've been lucky enough to be involved over the last couple of years in 2 projects that relate to Indigenous English learners. Oh, I should say who I am. I forgot. I'm Ilana Umansky, did I say that? And I'm at the University of Oregon, faculty here in the Ed Policy Department. And I know some of you from having been able to visit some CCSSO EL collaborative meetings in the past. But yeah, so I've been working on, my work centers on English learner policy. And for the last couple of years, I've been able to work on issues related to Indigenous English learner policy. By Indigenous here, I mean American Indian and Alaska Native specifically, although I know there are a lot of Indigenous ELs who, for instance, are coming from Mesoamerica and other places. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about these. You can go to the next slide, Megan. So this is just to say that in general, when we think about English learners, we think about students of immigrant origin, 1st or 2nd generation students who have a home language other than English. That's the main people we think about, students that we think about as English learners. But Indigenous English learners are a really important subgroup of English learners. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some of the characteristics of these students in a minute. But first, just to say that there actually are a number of states where Indigenous languages are amongst the top 5 English learner languages. And the green states, there are 9 of them where that's the case. And there's also 4 states in pink here where a non-standard English variety is one of the top 5 EL languages. And a lot of Indigenous students speak non-standard English varieties, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So Indigenous English learners are important to consider as a subgroup of ELs because their characteristics, their skills, and their needs in school may really differ from those of non-Indigenous English learners. The first reason why this is because Indigenous English learners are members of the original peoples of the US, and they have unique histories, unique connections to land here. And they also have unique linguistic, sociolinguistic, and educational histories in the US. And I'm sure you know about the history of boarding schools and really the forced stripping away of Indigenous languages, connection to community, and culture. So it's a very unique history that these students face. Another reason why Indigenous English learners may have different characteristics than non-Indigenous English learners is because the federal definition of an English learner is different for Indigenous students. And I just want to highlight this because I think some states are thinking a lot about this and then some aren't. So here is from the federal definition in ESEA. So the first, these are the sort of the groups of students who can be English learners. So those who were not born in the US or whose native language is a language other than English. That's the main group of ELs that we think about. But the very next clause says, who is a Native American or Alaska Native or a native resident of the outlying areas and who comes from an environment where a language other than English has had a significant impact on the individual's level of English language proficiency. So this is very different because Indigenous English learners, according to this federal definition, do not need to have a non-English language as their home language. What they need to have is a heritage language that has impacted their English language development. And as I mentioned before, a lot of Indigenous students in the US speak non-standard English varieties. And those non-standard English varieties are whole and complete English varieties that have developed historically over time based on the history, the social histories of the people that speak them, in part the impact from their heritage languages. So there's a lot of research on this and it's really interesting and I'm just starting to learn about it. But this is a really important distinction that Indigenous ELs do not, according to the federal definition, need to have a language other than English as their dominant language. Okay, next slide. So as I said, we're going to share these findings of 2 studies in an upcoming webinar. And the 2 studies, one is a 50-state scan on Indigenous EL identification policies across states. So how across states is policy enacted and delineated for identifying Indigenous ELs. And second, a brand new REL Northwest report on Indigenous EL identification, service provision, and reclassification, particularly in Alaska. Good, next slide, thank you. So just a couple things quickly about the 50-state scan. These are the questions that we're looking at across all states. How many states are differentiating EL identification policies for Indigenous students and how are they doing so? And what are the implications of having distinct state EL identification policies for Indigenous students? You can go to the next slide. And just to give you a little teaser of what we're finding, we have found 7 states. This is just through a web scan looking at state policies. 7 states have a clear differentiation for Indigenous student EL identification. 15 states have potential differentiation. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then 28 states have no differentiation at all in state policy from what we can find. So if you go to the next slide, this just gives you an example of those first 2 categories. So Alaska is an example of a state that has potential differentiation. In this state, all students take the home language survey as normal. But teachers then have the option of using a language observation checklist for students who were not tagged during the home language survey process because they only answered English. Teachers can then fill out this language observation checklist for students, and here I'll just read this quote here, who may have grown up in an environment in which a syntax, rhetorical style, and sociolinguistic patterns of the heritage language may have had a significant impact on the student's level of English proficiency. So we call this a potential differentiation, number 1, because teachers don't have to do this, it's just an option. And number 2, interestingly, this isn't tagged or identified as being for Indigenous students specifically. North Dakota, by contrast, is an example of a state that has clear differentiated policies. And here in the home language survey, you can see that they directly ask, would your child be considered a Native American or an Alaska Native student? And then it says Native American and Alaska Native students are mentioned specifically in the EL definition. Do you believe a tribal language has significantly influenced your child's education in English? Yes or no? And what is that tribal language? So that's an example of clear differentiated policies. So we're trying to learn about this. How did these come into place? What are states thinking about Indigenous EL identification? And so the next slide here is a request for all of you, which is that the next stage of this research is what we'd like to do is be able to talk to as many state EL directors as we can to really understand the policies that we found online and hear about the history. Who are the stakeholders? How did these policies develop? How do you think they're working? So we will be sending an email to you in the coming weeks, and we would be so grateful if you would take about 30 to 45 minutes just to talk to us about what you know, and it's fine if there are things that you don't know as well. So that's my little plug and request. And then I'll very briefly just talk about the REL report. This is a brand new report that just came out in May. And as I said, it's about Alaska Native English learner classified students. And in it, we ask questions about what are the characteristics of Alaska Native students who are classified as ELs, and how do those differ from non-Alaska Native ELs? How are Alaska Native students identified as ELs, and how are they served as English learners? And what are their reclassification patterns? This is the link to the report. As all REL reports, it's open access. So you can also just look for it on the IES REL report page. And then on the right-hand side is an infographic. That's just a little 2-page summary you can also find online. So just to give you a little sense of some of the things that we found, let's see here, let me go to my right page here. So the characteristics of Alaska Native EL classified students and their educational settings are very different from those of non-Alaska Native English learner students in Alaska. And those differences range from things like, one of the interesting differences we found is that there's far fewer EL teachers in the schools where Alaska Native ELs are concentrated. We also found that while differentiation in service provision is not widespread in Alaska, some districts are differentiating their services for Alaska Native ELs based on those different needs. And that takes the form of, for instance, in some districts, heritage language immersion programs. In other districts, community outreach programs where elders are brought into the schools to support Alaska Native English learners. And then finally, the outcomes of these students are suggestive that identification and service provision may not be operating well for Alaska Native EL students. So just as one example, Alaska Native EL students' reclassification rates by the end of 7th grade is 11%, which is very low and far lower than what we find in other states, and also far lower than what we find for non-Alaska Native English learners in Alaska. That's all I wanted to say. I really hope that you can come to the webinar. We'll keep you posted on when it comes, and also hopeful that you'll be willing to have a conversation with us about this over the phone in the coming weeks and months.
Alana, thank you so much. And I apologize I didn't introduce you. I just assumed everyone knew who you were. So my apologies, I should have done that. I'm so glad that you were able to pop in and share this new resource with us. It's certainly an important and overlooked population among students who are identified as English learners. Just a quick reminder to folks, you can go on the Member Hub and find all the materials for the next 3 days, PowerPoints. I'm keeping a running list of links that are shared through the chat, etc. At the link that I sent you. And I also shared a link to the COVID, there's so many acronyms right now going through my head, COVID resources as well. And I want to spend the next 15 to 18 minutes with letting you all share with one another and just check in informally, just to kind of bring us all together in this space. So I'm going to ask Kate to open breakout rooms for folks to join. Welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started with our next session in about 3 minutes. But before we do that, I wanted to just provide a quick overview for folks who are here in the room. So today we did our welcome and our check-ins. Over the next hour, we'll have updates from the U.S. Department of Education, and then later this afternoon, we'll have a presentation on using COVID relief funds for English learners. And then this evening is the opening / afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, is the opening plenary. And sorry, I'm trying to move slides. Tomorrow we have a panel of our state members on upholding EL civil rights, a presentation on EL teacher shortages, and then some continuing work on leading for EL equity. And then on the day 3, we have a joint session on using ELP assessment data. And then we're trying out state consultancies in the afternoon. And we'll wrap up, and the closing plenary will be that evening afternoon. So you're probably wondering, what are these little Twitter symbols? We haven't really used them as a collaborative before, so we're trying this out too as well. I have put little open Twitter symbols for any sessions that you are welcome to tweet in. And then a crossbar over those that are more state members only. Folks are sharing problems of practice. And so when it wouldn't necessarily be best practice to share on Twitter what you're hearing. These are from CCSSO. So when to use social media to highlight key moments in panel discussions or plenaries or presentations, to highlight guest speakers, high level takeaways, acknowledge guest speakers for their expertise, or share overall takeaways, lessons learned. When not to use it, again, sessions on the agenda that indicate no social media, and those tend to be kind of private conversations among state members. Also during breakout sessions is probably not the best time to use Twitter, but we do, or any kind of state specific information that isn't public or shared between colleagues. So that would be around, like, the consultancies would probably fall in that third bullet there. So just to, if you feel like tweeting, why not? We should share the important work that we're doing together. You can follow CCSSO on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. Some examples of things you could tweet if you are a tweeter or on Instagram. Examples here, like attending the collaboratives meeting is a great way to engage with SEA staff. Excited to dig into this topic today, or excited to hear from this presenter on this topic theme. And they encourage folks to use the state's leading hashtag, and you can tag CCSSO. So certainly not trying to endorse, like, have an advertisement here or anything, but if you all want to tweet about our collective work together, you are more than welcome to do so, and thought I would just share CCSSO's guidelines around that. So we're moving into